So what would it take to replace Games Workshop? That's the question we're exploring in this vlog, doing this miniature wargaming thing, doing this grimdark thing, building memories, building, painting, collecting, the social aspects of Warhammer 40,000 and Games Workshop. Certainly that is the strength. But I asked the question, other gaming companies, how come GW hasn't been dethroned yet? Especially with the medium that exists today with YouTube and podcasts and the ability to get the message out with different gaming systems. How come something hasn't challenged GW? Is the Grimdark really that awesome? And look, I love chainswords. I love bolt pistols. There is something very, very unique about Space Marines and immersing yourself in that narrative. I mean, GW has a fantastic narrative, and they push that out well. They've done that very well. So it's a question of narrative. It's also a question of GW has longevity. They have longevity. They've been pushing Warhammer 40,000, aka since Rogue Trader, since what, 87, 88, something from that perspective. So it's had that density to push, and it's had that density to penetrate. But this goes back to, well, there are other companies out there. And what's amazing, if you've been following Games Workshop for any amount of time, you know where it's like they do everything they can to alienate their community. And there's enough said on that. Like everything you can possibly do, they have done. And yet they're still number one. But there was a time when I'm sure GW was very, very nervous. X-Wing miniatures. Various reports come out every year, the top 5 gaming systems and looking at rankings and market penetration and sales. There was a year where like X-Wing was number 2 for a number of years. And I think one year it might have been number 1, X-Wing 1.0, before Fantasy Flight just kind of just nuked everything from that perspective. But in exploring that, Star Wars X-Wing had like not even triple threat. And I think one of the things that it pushed against GW was it had an IP that was as good, better, or amazing. Everybody knows Star Wars. It's a great sandbox to play in. The miniatures were pre-painted. Now you cut out that side of the hobby. But this is another vlog question too. How much does Games Workshop really make on the hobby side of paints and tools and scenery? Well, scenery they do, but the modeling side versus the miniature side. But the fact that these X-Wing miniatures are pre-painted means you could just jump right in. I loved X-Wing because it's like, first of all, I don't have to feel guilty about buying miniatures and not painting them, looking at stuff I have to break through. But it was something really nice of being at the gaming store and playing some games and being like, okay, pause for a second, going over, buying a $10 Starfighter, and then popping it out of the box and starting to play it. I mean, it was really, really cool from that perspective. And then, of course, the rules, certainly over time, they became a little bit more bloated with 1.0, but the rules were really, really awesome because you could just pick them up compared to Warhammer 40,000. So we saw this for a while. X-Wing miniatures was dominant. And then for various reasons, it faded away. Well, we'll put that fade away for another time. But I believe, then I'm going to turn it over to you guys, I believe the reason why GW is number 1 and continues to be number 1 because they control their IP. They control it. I'm not talking about like shutting down YouTube channels and bloggers and things like that, meaning they have created the Grimdark. They direct the Grimdark. They're not buying and licensing Star Wars. Now, they've got Lord of the Rings. Well, I guess you could counter with that. But that's a great example. But Lord of the Rings is not their flagship. Lord of the Rings, I mean, certainly it brings in money and it works both ways. But from that perspective, if they lost Lord of the Rings, they're not at the mercy of that. Their whole business model is not at the mercy of that, which compare that to Fantasy Flight Games. What's interesting to me about Fantasy Flight was originally they had their own titles that they supported. Yes, for a while they did some GW titles like Talisman, but they actively supported Terranoth and the Runebound universe. And over time they switched to licensing titles, X-Wing, titles like that. So once you start shifting your game design to a license, at any moment that gets pulled, you're in trouble. Games Workshop doesn't have that liability at all. And they direct it and they enforce it. So I think that alone is the strength why something has not dethroned Games Workshop. Because X-Wing Miniatures, just as an example, had the great gameplay, had the miniatures, had the Star Wars universe. You walk in, you see the game, you know exactly what it is right away. Where you see Warhammer 40,000, you're like, oh, it's pretty cool, but like, why is there some demon fighting a tank? And why does that guy have a chainsaw? Like you really got to kind of look and find out what's going on. Of course, once the lore pulls you in, they've got you hooked. But that is the success. And I think it would require a company with longevity over time to have their own IP and use that and leverage that to dethrone GW. If at this point it even ever really happens, could happen. And here's the biggest question. Would we want it to happen?